Climate change is a big deal, even for a drought-tolerant species like Agave Utahensis. So that's what we're talking about in this video. What are the impacts that climate change is going to have on Agave Utahensis? So I'm pretty sure that most folks who watch my channel regularly understand that climate change is a very real and pressing concern for many types of plants and animal species, including humans all over the world. But what is climate change going to do specifically to Agave Utahensis? That's what we're talking about today. So first, let's understand the situation as it pertains specifically to the area around Las Vegas here where Agave Utahensis grows. So the first thing to understand is that Las Vegas is one of the fastest warming cities due to climate change in the US, right? And in fact, July of 2024 was the hottest month ever recorded in Las Vegas history. And in fact, we had a record high temperature reached 120 degrees, which isn't something that we've ever seen in recorded history in the Las Vegas Valley. And in fact, summer of 2024 overall was the hottest summer ever recorded in Las Vegas history. And in fact, the average summer high temperature was 107 degrees. So climate change, of course, temperatures, extreme temperatures are one thing. Another thing that climate change causes is a lack of moisture. And in fact, droughts have become more frequent and more intense across the entire desert Southwest, including the southern Nevada, Las Vegas area where Agave Utahensis grows. And in fact, droughts have become pretty commonplace since the 1980s. And beyond just drought and extreme temperatures, wildfires are another thing that climate change is making more severe and more intense. Central Nevada and southern Nevada, again, right in the heart of Agave Utahensis territory, have been seeing more and more fire weather days since the 1970s. And a fire weather day is considered a day where it's really hot, dry, and windy. So when we talk about what that situation, what that climate change situation is going to do, the impact it's going to have on Agave Utahensis, there's two buckets to consider, right? There's a positive and then there's a negative. And so we'll start with the positive. And it's not that these things are a positive impact on Agave Utahensis, but basically the good news in the story about Agave Utahensis. So the first thing to talk about is that Agave Utahensis, like many cactus and succulents, is primarily a CAM photosynthesizer, right? And what CAM photosynthesis is basically is a form of photosynthesis where the stoma, which are the small sort of mouth-like appendages on a leaf that take in carbon dioxide to be used in the photosynthetic process. In most plants, C3 and C4 plants, which are plants like crop plants like corn and all that kind of stuff. Most other plants that aren't CAM plants are C3 and C4 plants. Those stoma are open during the day because the sun is out during the day. That's when photosynthesis is happening with the sun's energy, and the plant needs carbon dioxide to facilitate that process. The challenge with that sort of photosynthesis in an arid climate like the one that cactuses and succulents are adapted to is that an open stoma allows a lot of the plant's water to evaporate in a very dry and hot condition. So CAM plants have evolved a mechanism by which they can only open their stoma, only open those mouth-like appendages on the leaf at night when temperatures are lower and there's less of risk of moisture evaporation. They take in the carbon dioxide, then they store it in a form, in a CAM form, which is, or a crassulin acid form. That's basically just an acid where the carbon dioxide is stored. And then they utilize that carbon dioxide during the day when their stoma are closed to photosynthesize. Now, Agave Utahensis is primarily a CAM plant. There is some plasticity there in that if an agave plant is given a lot of water, if there's a lot of rain, or if it's grown in cultivation and it's been given a lot of water, it can actually also switch to the normal form of photosynthesis, which I believe makes it grow faster and more robustly. But if necessary, and I believe most Agave Utahensis plants out in habitat, they use this CAM photosynthesis. So as plants go, Agave Utahensis, being a CAM plant, is fairly well suited to a arid and hot future because it can photosynthesize while keeping its stoma closed during the day. And in fact, some research has gone into agave in general, and even Agave Utahensis specifically, as a climate change resistant form of biofuel crop. And then alongside that is the fact that Agave Utahensis is the most cold hardy form of agave. And that might seem like a bit of a misnomer when I say this is a positive adaptation for why Agave Utahensis is uniquely suited to handling a climate change future where the temperatures are more extreme. But climate change is not only increasing the temperature, it's also decreasing the temperature in some places and increasing extreme weather events. And a cold hardy plant like Agave Utahensis can live in places where it's extremely hot during the summer, where it's pretty hot and dry during the summer. We're going to talk about why it can't really live where it's extremely hot during the summer, but can also handle, winters covered in snow, which is the situation that you find in a lot of places like central and southern Nevada, particularly up in the mountains, where it is very hot and dry during the summer, but then there is, especially if you're up in the mountains, quite a bit of cold temperatures and snow precipitation. So its CAM photosynthesis gives it drought hardiness, and its cold tolerance makes it a very cold hardy plant. And it's also a very slow growing plant, and that's a positive when it comes to a climate change future, because being a slow growing plant, it's able to conserve resources. It doesn't have a very short window where it needs to grow really, really fast, and so it needs a whole bunch of moisture and just the right temperatures, and it can kind of, not exactly go dormant, but it can grow very slowly if it needs to. It can be coaxed into growing faster like in cultivation, but the fact that it's a slow growing plant is a positive adaptation for a climate change future. And related to that is the fact that it's monocarpic. And monocarpic, of course, meaning that Agave Utahensis only flowers once in its life and then dies. There are triggers, probably hormonal triggers. Auxins are a class of chemicals, basically plant hormones, that trigger when an Agave Utahensis is going to flower, when a mature Agave Utahensis will flower. And those probably have a lot to do with both moisture, right? It's only going to flower, hopefully, in a year where there's enough moisture to support the flowering process. And then generally, I believe, they mostly flower when they can sense that they've done quite a bit of vegetative propagation already, right? If a plant is a solitary plant, I think generally speaking, it's a little bit less likely that it will flower and die. But once that plant has some sort of signals that it has produced vegetatively, a bunch of offsets vegetatively, then I believe it's much more likely to start the flowering process. And that's a positive when it comes to a climate change future, because basically it can kind of time, not every year is going to be the driest and the hottest going forward into a climate change future. And Agave Utahensis has a bit of flexibility in basically choosing through this auxin signaling which years to flower, and ideally it's going to choose the most moisture-rich years. And that vegetative propagation also gives it an advantage in a climate change future, because the flowering process is fairly moisture dependent. It's got to produce nectar in that giant flower stalk. It's got to first produce that giant flower stalk, which takes a ton of nutrients and energy and water. And then it's got to produce all that nectar that it produces to attract pollinators. And again, that's also a very moisture demanding process. And so vegetative propagation, which is, basically when it produces offsets, when an Agave Utahensis plant starts to produce offsets from its rhizome, from its root system, that is a very climate change friendly way to reproduce, right? Because it kind of can create its own sort of nurse plant. The larger parent Agave Utahensis can shield the younger offset that's growing from its base from excessive UV stress. The shape of the plant can also funnel water down to the roots in a way that a small plant won't be able to collect as much water. So there are a bunch of benefits to the vegetative propagation that Agave Utahensis, particularly Agave Utahensis nevadensis, does that will allow it to adapt to a climate change future. But of course, it's not all roses and Agave Utahensis flower stalks when it comes to the future of Agave Utahensis in a climate change future. There are a bunch of negatives. There are a bunch of potential threats that come from climate change when it comes to Agave Utahensis. Firstly, Nevada could see, some experts believe that Nevada could see a loss of up to 30% of its forests. And many of the most prolific Agave Utahensis habitats are in like pinyon juniper woodland forests, right? And so if there's a loss of forests, there's going to be downstream effects of a loss of forest that will affect Agave Utahensis. And Of course, we talked about how Nevada, southern Nevada, is one of the fastest warming places in the country due to climate change. Those higher and higher temperatures are not great for Agave Utahensis. Like I said, Agave Utahensis is the most cold hardy agave species, and it's drought tolerant because of its CAM photosynthesis. But as I've noticed from my own experience growing Agave Utahensis seedlings here down in the valley of Las Vegas, much lower than it grows up in the mountains, it burns, it melts in full sun, in full heat, very, very quickly, like in a matter of hours, okay? And so Agave Utahensis is the most cold hardy tolerant form of agave. It is not the most heat tolerant form of agave. Now, and we've talked about the fact that Agave Utahensis lives up in sky islands, right? Basically, Agave Utahensis lives at higher bands of elevation because it can't live on the dry, hot desert floor where the temperatures would, even before climate change really started ramping up, the temperatures down on the valley floor are far too hot for Agave Utahensis. So generally, it grows up in mountains and what we call sky islands. And we call them sky islands because basically the hot desert floor, if you imagine that forms sort of an ocean that Agave Utahensis can't grow in, it can only grow in certain elevation bands up at the top of mountains. So those are kind of like islands. And so each individual population of Agave Utahensis growing at its own island is separated from every other kind of agave or every other population of Agave Utahensis. And those sky islands have imposed a kind of isolation between populations. There is not a lot of cross-pollination happening between these sky island populations. And that's cool on one hand, right? Because you have this really cool diversity of Agave Utahensis plants. If you visit 5 different Agave Utahensis populations, you're gonna see many different forms of Agave Utahensis. That variability is something that's really cool about it. But it does present a problem when it comes to climate change because as temperatures overall rise, Agave Utahensis is going to get pushed higher and higher in those elevation bands into more and more isolated sky islands. And not only are those sky islands going to be more isolated, which will cause a lack of genetic diversity, but they are generally, because mountains are, mountain shaped, they're pyramid shaped, the further up you go, the less area there is. So there's going to be loss of habitat. Even if they're still able to live in a given area just higher up, that means they're going to be losing habitat as the rising temperatures push them higher up into higher sky islands. And we talked about the fact that droughts are becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly intense here in the desert Southwest, and that is also going to be true for Agave Utahensis. Of course, one major reason that they grow in those sky islands is because the higher up in elevation you go, the more precipitation you get. But even that precipitation that falls up in the mountaintops in Agave Utahensis habitat is going to decrease with a climate change future. So there is going to be less and less moisture for Agave Utahensis to live off. Thankfully, it's a CAM plant. It's well suited for those drought conditions, but it's not going to be suited for them forever. It can't go forever without water, obviously. And then what moisture does fall in Agave Utahensis habitat is going to be in the form of more and more severe extreme weather events, because that's another effect of climate change is the increase in severe weather events. And in fact, just last year or so, last winter, we saw a number of really damaging, basically hurricanes or remnants of hurricanes that came through and hit the mountains where Agave Utahensis lives. And had a big impact on humans wanting to recreate in these areas because it did huge damage, washed out a whole bunch of trails. But it's also eroding the soil from Agave Utahensis habitat. Agave Utahensis lives in many cases in very gravel-rich, very loose substrate, mollisoil in a lot of cases, which is very fertile, basically gravel mixed with organic material. And as those severe weather events happen more and more frequently because of climate change, a lot more of that soil is going to be eroded. We've seen the effect of, I've shown on my Instagram, the effect of floods, flash flooding, which happens in the desert naturally, but it's happening more frequently because of climate change, has on other cactuses. It uproots, big giant pharaoh cactuses very dramatically and lays them on their side. And it's only a matter of time before this begins to, or before this increasingly affects Agave Utahensis. Now I've mentioned that the fact that Agave Utahensis is monocarpic, and that's probably a good thing when it comes to climate change because it can kind of pick and choose which season to flower in. But an increase in temperature and a decrease in moisture is probably going to disrupt that flowering cycle to some degree. I've seen in habitat, already, and I haven't been going into habitat for decades or hundreds of years, obviously, so I can't tell whether or not what I've seen has to do with climate change or whether or not it just naturally happens. But as the seasons change because of temperature increases and moisture decreases, Agave Utahensis seems to be flowering off cycle, right? I've seen a number of plants out in habitat that start to flower in the fall or much later than the rest of a lot of plants. And Agave Utahensis is believed to be an obligate outcrosser, which means it needs to, when it flowers, it needs to be around a bunch of other flowering Agave Utahensis plants so that it can cross-pollinate and produce as many viable seeds as possible. And speaking of pollinators, climate change has a pretty dramatic impact on the pollinators. Agave Utahensis is primarily, like many agave species, primarily bat pollinated, but it can also be pollinated by a number of other, moths and bees and things like that, all of which are negatively impacted by climate change. So the pollinators necessary to pollinate Agave Utahensis are also decreasing because of climate change. And while pollinators are decreasing, there are also invasive species that are increasing because of climate change, right? Because Agave Utahensis is a native plant to this area, it is adapted to the conditions that this area have seen for hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of years. But as those conditions change, as temperatures rise and moisture levels decrease, there are invasive species that are encroaching into Agave Utahensis habitat and could potentially, like cheatgrass is one of them. That's the scientific name for cheatgrass is Bromus tectorum, is a big problem across southern Nevada in general and does exist into the pinyon juniper woodlands where Agave Utahensis grows, up in elevation, and it could start to outcompete Agave Utahensis for space and for soil nutrition. And along with that increase in invasive species, we also have an increase of fire frequency and severity. As I mentioned, climate change is driving an increase in number of fire weather days where it's hot, dry, and windy, and invasive species like cheatgrass are very, very susceptible to wildfire. I have seen areas in Agave Utahensis habitat where it looks like sometime in the past, decades ago, there were pretty significant fires. Agave Utahensis isn't some big tree that can really withstand a fire, and so fire is a pretty big concern for Agave Utahensis, being a slow-growing plant where it's producing clumps that could be 100 or hundreds of years old. If those get burned, that's a really devastating loss for that population of Agave Utahensis and for the genetic diversity in that area. So that's all doom and gloom, but let's talk about what we can do as Agave Utahensis nerds and collectors and cactus and succulent growers to try to mitigate some of the impact of climate change on Agave Utahensis. The first thing that we can do is understand how ex situ cultivation, ex situ conservation can help Agave Utahensis. Now, in situ is a Latin word, basically that means in situation, in habitat, right? And so in situ conservation would be doing what we can to make sure that the Agave Utahensis plants that are in habitat stay there, right? And then ex situ conservation would basically be, working to make sure that there are a lot of Agave Utahensis plants in cultivation out of their habitat to keep genetic diversity safe. And so the way that we can affect both of those things as collectors, or one way that we can affect both of those things as collectors, is by making sure we're not buying habitat collected plants. Even if it's legal, it's not poached, we've talked about that quite a bit on this channel, there are likely unsustainable and unethical harvesting, wild collection, digging plants up from the wild that is occurring, and I think that's the majority of Agave Utahensis plants on the market fall into that bucket. And those operations are not increasing the number of Agave Utahensis plants in the world, they're decreasing them, and they're definitely not helping genetic diversity of Agave Utahensis at all. And instead of buying wild collected, instead of buying plants that have been dug up from the wild, we should ensure that we're only buying seed-grown Agave Utahensis plants. And I would even say that we should buy seed-grown as opposed to, if tissue culturing becomes a major thing with Agave Utahensis, because loss of plant numbers, net plant number reduction is one concern, but it's not the only concern when it comes to the effect of climate change on Agave Utahensis. Because of their isolation in the Sky Islands, because of the disruption of the flowering cycle, because of the loss of pollinators, genetic diversity is going to become endangered by climate change and by poaching as well. And that diversity, that variability is one of the coolest things about Agave Utahensis. And if we're buying wild collected plants, we are damaging biodiversity. If we're buying tissue cultured plants, we are also damaging biodiversity. We're essentially creating monocultures is what tissue culturing does, which has already damaged biodiversity when it comes to agave used to make tequila. So when it comes to Agave Utahensis, we really need to focus on only buying seed-grown Agave Utahensis plants. And so that's the most straightforward thing that we can do as Agave Utahensis nerds and collectors to help mitigate some of the damage that climate change could cause to Agave Utahensis. But there are a couple other things that can be done kind of on the research side to help Agave Utahensis survive climate change. One of those things is related to Project Eborespina, which is my personal project to document and survey Agave Utahensis Eborespina populations out in habitat. Basically, I've got a plan to go visit as many Eborespina populations as I possibly can and do a survey and basically estimate how many Agave Utahensis Eborespina plants there are in habitat. And that way, in a couple of years, perhaps I can repeat or somebody else can repeat this survey and we can see if climate change is dramatically reducing or poaching is dramatically reducing the number of Agave Utahensis Eborespina plants out in habitat. And I've talked about that before on the channel, and I'll link to that video here so you can learn more about Project Eborespina if you want to. And the other thing that we can talk about is something called assisted migration. Now, when habitat loss affects an animal, it can just kind of get up if there's room. It can get up and move. It can migrate basically to find new habitat if it's available. That, of course, isn't impossible for plants. They don't have legs. They can't walk. And so migration of plant species from one habitat to another often occurs much slower than an effect like climate change would have. So as the sky islands, as those areas in which Agave Utahensis can survive go higher and higher up in elevation because of the warming climate, we may be able to assist in planting new Agave Utahensis plants, ideally seed-grown Agave Utahensis plants, in some higher elevation areas, essentially assisting its migration into new habitat areas where it can survive. And I haven't read anything about this happening now, and of course this is a project that would have to involve a number of parties and governmental agencies and all that kind of stuff. But it's something that I think is an interesting possibility and something we should probably start to research pretty soon. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. What are your biggest concerns about climate change, and how do you think Agave Utahensis is going to fare when it comes to a climate change future? Thanks for watching.